afternoon. I want to welcome all my friends who are with me here on Zoom and to all of you who are joining on Facebook or YouTube or all the other ways that people join. It's really wonderful to have you here. And I hope that you're taking very good care of yourself through all of these all the interesting permutations of American civilization that we're experiencing right now. So welcome. It's good to have you here. We've been learning the book of Psalms. Book of Psalms is a book of the Hebrew Bible. It's the first book of the section called Ketuvim, and it's a book of religious imagination and religious emotion. It's important to remember that this book is not theological in its principal intent. That is, there's theology there. There's a philosophical look at the world. There are ideas and beliefs that enable the psalmist, the poet of each particular chapter, to interpret the world that he or she is living in. But fundamentally, this is not a book meant to teach theology, to teach a particular point of view. It's a book to share emotions, to share our emotional responses to the world about us. And that's important because I think too often Jewish life gets really deeply invested in the intellectual side of spirituality, and emotions that take a sort of secondary role. But we are an emotional people. We're a feeling people. We are creatures who meet the world through our emotions. And this is a book which reflects upon the full repertoire of human emotional responses to life. So we've seen already in our conversations up till now, psalms of celebration and joy, of happiness, psalms of redemption, psalms with that wonderful sense of having been redeemed and rescued from danger, psalms of yearning. And the last few weeks, we've been talking about psalms of protest. What does it mean to sing a song in the face of disappointment? And there, I have to go back to the previous comment because there is a theology at the heart of this. The song is being sung to God. And the theology of ancient Israelite religion is that God is the one in charge of history. And the events that have occurred to us, personal events and collective events, therefore reflect the will of God in some way. And it is toward God that we direct our sense of gratitude for great things that happen, and of disappointment for events that break our hearts, and of pain, and of sometimes even of rage. And that's what we find in these psalms. We've looked now at two of them in terms of personal responses. Today, what I want to do is take a look at two psalms which reflect on collective experiences of disappointment, of tragedy, of desolation, even of cognitive dissonance, as we'll see, a sense of this isn't the way the world is supposed to be. And what I want to show, and I think it's really remarkable, and it's something that we'll talk about in the course of our conversation today, is how is it that a faith tradition is able to contain and embrace that cognitive dissonance without breaking? That is, it's the psalmist doesn't say, I don't believe in you anymore, God, and leave. He doesn't walk away from the table. He stays at the table in an encounter with the divine, with God, even though God has betrayed him, even though God has not lived up to the expectations that the psalmist began with. And the question is, how does that happen? How do you do that? How do we do that in personal life? What happens when you're in a relationship with someone, a personal relationship, a business relationship, and the person disappoints you? Under what circumstances do you break the relationship and walk away? And under what circumstances do you stay in it and say, I'm hurt? You've hurt me. And how do we fight through that? And then collectively, when we're faced with a sense of this isn't the way things were supposed to work out, when do we stay? When do we leave? And how does one stay within a religious tradition when that religious tradition has led us to expect certain things and other things happen, or different things happen, contrary things happen? And that's a very interesting conversation, a very interesting way of understanding how do you deal with the world as it's given to us. If the world were only redemptive, if all of our experiences were positive and happy and joyful, sweet, kind, then we would never ask this question. But in any relationship, those of you who are married certainly knows this. Those of you who have raised children certainly know this. Those of you who have ever been in a relationship where you invest the other person in a great deal of your feelings and your trust, and sometimes there's betrayal, sometimes there's desolation and despair, even bitterness? How do you hold on? How do you repair that? How do you fix those circumstances? So let's begin. The event that is at the core of these particular Psalms is the destruction that came in the year 586 BCE. So quickly, a history lesson, very quickly. Moses carries, Abraham, let's begin at the beginning, okay? Abraham, approximately 1300, or a little more, 1500 BCE, before zero. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. With Joseph, we go down into Egypt. We live in Egypt for 400 years. Actually, it wouldn't be 400 years, it'd be closer to 200 years. And in Egypt, 400 is a symbolic number of the Bible. In Egypt, we are enslaved by the Pharaoh. Moses takes us out of Egypt approximately 1250 BCE, more or less. We arrive in Canaan. We settle in Canaan. We live in a tribal confederation until about 1000 BCE, when the people of Israel come to the prophet Samuel and say, make us a king. And King Saul is the first one, but he fails terribly. King David is the greatest king of Israel. King David, followed by King Solomon, create an empire. Upon the death of Solomon, this is all of Jewish history in a nutshell, the kingdom splits north and south. The northern kingdom becomes prosperous and powerful. The southern kingdoms are sort of backwater. And then rise empires. The great empires of the east, of Mesopotamia, rise up. And in order to control the world, what you wanted to do, if you're an empire, was control the highway between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And guess who lives on that highway? That's right. That's where we live. We are people of the highway, right on the highway. So in 722, the Assyrian Empire, Assyria is what we call today Mosul, a great city-state in North Mesopotamia, North Iraq, comes across southern Syria, down the Fertile Crescent, down the coastal highway. And when they're met with resistance from the northern kingdom of Israel, they smash it, they destroy it. It is the policy of ancient kingdoms that to pacify a land, you take away its major citizens. So the leadership of the kingdom is taken back to the imperial capital in Assyria, where they disappear from history. We don't hear from them again. The population either stays where they are or drifts southward back to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem now becomes a great city. But the Assyrians do not destroy Jerusalem. They sack it, they take its treasures, but they leave it alone. And Jerusalem goes on for another 100 years, when the next great empire, the Babylonians, come. The Babylonians repeat the same pattern. They come across southern Syria. They come to the coastal highway. Down the coastal highway, they besiege the city of Jerusalem, take its treasures, but they also leave it be. They take away the king and the leading citizens. This is 597 BCE. And they leave behind a puppet king who rules for 10 years. And then the people rise up against Babylon. They refuse to pay their tribute, their taxes. So the Babylonians return now in 586. And this time they destroy the city of Jerusalem. They desolate the city, and they leave the city desolate, and they destroy the temple, the holy temple of Jerusalem. But here's the problem. And the problem is that the people of Jerusalem have developed an ideology. From the first time that they're besieged by the Assyrians in 722, they come to believe themselves as exempt, invulnerable, not affected by all the exigencies of history. We are God's people. This is God's city. That's God's house. We worship God. God's priests worship God. Nothing can happen to us. The fact that the Assyrians come and then they withdraw and don't attack the city reinforces that sensation, that idea. It's what Prophet Jeremiah is fighting against, but he doesn't succeed. The people truly believe that nothing bad can happen to them. Comes the Babylonians in 597 and they sack the city, but they don't destroy the temple. And that idea becomes even stronger. So by 586, the people of Jerusalem truly believe that nothing bad can happen to them. that they are outside of history, exempt from the exigencies, the accidents of history, invulnerable, invincible. And so when the Babylonians come in 586 and siege the city and destroy the city, it comes as a terrible shock. Even though Jerusalem was a small, marginal city, it wasn't a very powerful city, even though its defenses were not all that powerful, the people couldn't believe that this would happen to them. And when they're taken off to exile, and the leading citizens are taken off to exile, there is a sense not only of disappointment, of despair, a sense of tragedy, but there's a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. How can this be happening to us? How can this be happening? Don't you know who we are? How can this be happening? And that's what the psalmist is going to reflect upon. Now, the populace comes to Babylon. Remember, the regnant theory was that if you take the leadership of a community, the king, the priests, the leading citizens, the merchant class, the intellectuals, the thought leaders, and you bring them to a foreign country, separated from their land, separated from their language, separated from their culture, separated from the worship of their God, because after all, gods were considered local, separated from all that connected them to their original identity, they will assimilate and acculturate quickly into the imperial identity, into the imperial metropolis, and disappear. And that's what happened to all the ancient peoples of the East. They all disappeared into the metropolis, into the cosmopolitan culture of empire. But the Israelites are a unique case because they pushed back against that cultural assimilation. And no one had ever thought of this before. Everyone assumed that separated from your land, separated from your language, separated from your people, separated from your culture, you were going to become what everybody else was. And it should have happened that way. I mean, you move into a nice Babylonian suburb and you send your kids to the local public high school, and your daughter dates the beautiful, tall, good-looking Babylonian quarterback of the Babel High. And after the games on Friday night, they go off to McMarduk's for a Big Mac and a shake. And, within a generation or two, you're gone. But something happened. And part of it is reflected in these Psalms. Part of it is reflected in the Psalms. It's the pushback, a new ideology. Because the question they were asking is the great post-Holocaust question. The destruction of our temple, does that mean God hates us? Does that mean our covenant, our identity, our ideology is gone? Or is there some way to go on being Jewish in this new circumstance? That's the question. So let's take a look inside. There's a psalm that you all know, right? By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Well, by the waters of Babylon means that Babylon was a city with canals. Remember, it's on the river, so it's city full. So they gave us good housing. I mean, in fact, the Babylonians were actually pretty good to us. Actually, they let the Israelite people live. They did not molest them in any way. They allowed them to build homes and businesses and engage in their cultural life. Again, on the theory that once you're out of your culture, you'll soon disappear. So by the waters of Babylon, it's like saying in Beverly Hills, there we sat and we wept as we thought of Zion. They didn't forget so quickly. They didn't give up the remembrance of the places they'd come from. That was still something very powerful to them. There on the poplars, we hung our lyres, that's our guitars, for our captors asked us for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of those songs of Zion. Sing us one of them Jewish songs. Sing us a song of your homeland. Sing us one of your ancient songs. And here's the line. How can we sing a song to the Lord on alien soil? Can we be Jews here far away from home? Is it possible? Is our faith local or is our faith cosmopolitan? Is our faith tied to land and city and institution like temple? Or is our faith in some sense portable? Where does God live? I know that sounds like an odd question, but gods were local back then. When in Rome, you worship like a Roman. Gods were local. Does God follow us into exile? And here the psalmist proclaims something which is quite remarkable. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Now, there's two things about this. Number one, it doesn't say what you think it's going to say. You think it's going to say, if I forget you, God, if I forget you, my culture. But Jerusalem here becomes the symbol. Jerusalem becomes the symbol of all that is authentically us. Now, that's an important move because that's what's going to happen to Jerusalem through all Jewish history. Jerusalem was never a place for Jews. Jerusalem was an idea. It was a symbol of our identity, a symbol of our dreams, a symbol of our rootedness in the world. If I forget to Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, but go the other way around. If I forget Jerusalem, I have no power in the world. I cease to be me. I lose my identity. I cease my words. I won't be able to speak. I won't be able to act. Jerusalem, or my identity as a Jew, is what enables me to be me. It's who I am. If I don't keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. That's the important thing is that's why, by the way, in a Sephardic wedding, you ever been to a Sephardic wedding? They read this psalm at the end of the wedding before the groom breaks the glass. Now, breaking of the glass at the end of a wedding is an old custom. And it's one of those customs that's so old that nobody remembers exactly what it was supposed to mean. I mean, literally, it's one of these, it's the ritual has outlasted its interpretation. But for many Jews, it represents the broken Jerusalem. And so at a Sephardic wedding, this psalm is recited as if to say the breaking of the glass at the moment of wedding, which is the happiest moment of life, is in remembrance of the Jerusalem that has been broken. And now the psalmist, remember I told you this is emotion, not theology. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall. Now the Edomites are the Babylonians. How they cried, strip her, fair Babylon, you predator. Blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. We're going to get you bastards. So his motivation isn't just his love of Jerusalem and attachment to the ideals and to the hopes and to the dreams that are associated with Jerusalem. And it's not just motivated by the sense of despair of exile, but there's also an element of vengeance in this. Let's go get the bastards. Because what they did to us, and the notion of strip her, in the prophets in particular, in Ezekiel and in second Isaiah, you find this image of Jerusalem as a woman who has been shamed, who has been ravished, that she has been, her defenses were taken down and she was ravished. And here you get this idea that Babylon, it wasn't enough simply to destroy the city as a strategic location, they had to humiliate it. And so what's the answer? If you humiliate the mother, then the answer is we humiliate yours, right? Blessing on him who repays you in kindness what you've inflicted on us. Blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them on rocks. That doesn't sound quite Jewish, thank you. But the idea there being that Mother Jerusalem was ravished by these guys, and therefore we owe it back to them. So this is the rage and the bitterness and the anguish and the pain of what we call exile. This is the experience of exile. And you imagine this people by the waters of Babylon, living a materially prosperous life, but feeling so bereft, so broken, so empty, and in many ways so deeply betrayed. Betrayed, of course, by the Babylonians who didn't need to do this, but betrayed as well by the God who was supposed to protect them. All right, let's take a moment because we're going to move to another psalm, which is even more powerful in the same vein. But I want to see if there's any questions from our studio audience. Any questions, guys? Yeah, Stanley, you want to talk? Are you raising your hand? Yeah, Stan.
Uh, I was wondering how many in the thousands or tens of thousands or whatever people do you think were in Babylon that was this community, and how many were left in Jerusalem?
Well,
And
that's a
how big
great question.
are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you'll find that question is dealt with a lot in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah when they talk about going back. Um, I don't think that the city of Jerusalem ever passed 10,000 people, the whole city. You got to remember that ancient cities and ancient villages were not nearly as big as we think of cities today.
I know.
You know, these are towns, villages. They were small. I mean, you don't have means of transportation. You don't have means of water. You don't have, I mean, so if the whole city of Jerusalem's maybe 10,000 people, maybe. So they took away 1,000 people, took away 1,000 people. But they were the 1,000 people that mattered. You see, they were the 1,000 people whose leadership led the community, 1,000 people whose ideas shaped the community. These are small groups of people. I mean, again, if you're the prophet and you want to get your word out to a community, how do you publish it? This is a few years before social media was invented. I mean, the social media of the Bible is you stood in the middle of a square on a box and shouted as loud as you could. That's social media. And maybe if you had a guy, Jeremiah had a guy named Baruch, who was his scribe. He would write down what Jeremiah said. And no doubt, but remember, everything had to be handwritten. There's no printing. So even writing doesn't give you much of a reach. So you're talking about very small groups of people. Okay, Bill. Yeah, Bill.
So I did an opera talk on Nabucco, which is this story, okay?
Yeah.
And when I did, I got out a map and I looked at the distance we're talking about. The distance from Jerusalem to where this story is supposed to be by the waters of Babylon was hundreds and hundreds of miles. Is that historically accurate?
Sure, you walked.
For a long
there were roads. There were roads. They had roads. Sure. No, you can walk. Look, we have pilgrimage festivals, right? Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos are pilgrimage festivals. People walked from all over. Now, it could take you 3 weeks to walk it. It could take you 2 months. Take you a month to walk it. But sure, if further, you're used to walking, because again, this is before Toyotas were invented. Yeah. So you went places by walking. But how much can you cover in a day if you walk? 10 miles a day?
Yeah.
So if it's 10 miles a day and you walk for a month, what do you get? You get 300 miles.
Wow, yeah.
You can do it. But and you're used to this. I mean, because you had occasions to walk long distances. Yeah, absolutely possible.
I thought it looked like a really long distance, but I may have had the wrong spot in Babylon.
No. It can be a really long distance, but again, people took their. So you take 6 months to go. You stop along the way. You even wait out the winter and then keep walking.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Right? Amazing. Look, I mean, it's every time I fly east. Every time I fly to New York for a business meeting, and I fetch, mightily to my wife about how I have to schlep to the airport and step through the security and get on the plane. And, it's 6 hours and my back is killing me. And then you look down and you imagine what it was like to cross the American frontier in a Conestoga wagon. It would take, how long would it take to go from St. Louis, Missouri to Sacramento, California on a Conestoga wagon drawn by an ox? And I'm fetching of the 5 hours I'm sitting on an airplane, with my second, with my my second bag of chips and Diet Coke. I mean, we have a different sense of distance than our ancestors did, and a different sense of the pace of things than our ancestors did. Yeah, sure. Douglas, you're muted. You're muted. Can't hear you. There you go. Thanks, bro. Try it again. I still can't hear you. You're still muted. Here, I'll unmute you there. Try it now. Where did Doug go? Doug, unmute. I'm trying to unmute him, and I can't unmute him. He just unvideoed him.
Mm.
Wait. Try it again. Do it again. Now.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, first of all, the seats are less comfortable, on the flights, particularly coach. And second of all, um, when they were there, these are the people that wrote the Torah at the same time,
Well, that's
or
a great.
or put the Torah into written
Yes,
form.
not wrote it. I think that the theory that most critical Bible scholars will offer you is that they had documents. They already had written documents. They edited them together. They put them together.
So the R person is during this time, but the other people existed before that. The other
Yeah,
writings
J, E,
existed.
P, and D all exist as documents, but these are the people that put them together into one coherent. And you can understand why. If you're living in a place, if you're in a place where you do not have a,
a long time ago, I can't remember what day it was.
somebody talking?
Old pomegranate?
There, try that. If you're in a place where you do not have a cultural core, you don't have an institution, you don't have a temple, you don't have a communal leadership, right? You don't have a JCC. So you need something to hold identity. And the idea that identity could be built around a book is the amazing revolution of this generation. That identity, and it's only one generation, because 75 years in Babylon, they're starting to return already, right? Under Cyrus, the Persian king. But so you have this idea that we can build an identity around a book, that the book can replace the physical institution of a temple. That's exactly who you're talking about, right? And that, by the way, explains certain elements of the book. Why is it that in the book of Genesis, it's always the younger son overcoming the older one? Well, if you're the people who are downtrodden, bereft of your land, feeling anxiety of exile, wouldn't you want to tell a story that says the one who is in power, it's only an illusion? Power is an illusion because at any moment God can turn it, and the one who is powerless can become powerful, and the one who is powerful can become powerless. And those are the great stories of the book of Genesis. The younger kid always prevails, right? And that's because you're trying to aid this population in exile in holding on to their ideals, holding on to their identity. Stan.
Yes, and how can you reconcile the previous stories when they talk about 600,000 people in the Exodus days and hundreds of thousands of people walking through the desert with these stories of, you say, we're talking about 1,000 people?
There's an old joke, my friend. Two rabbis are talking, and one rabbi says, so tell me, how many people come to your shul on a Shabbos when you don't have a bar mitzvah? And the rabbi says, oh, we get 300 every single week. So the friend visits the shul, and on a Shabbos morning, there's 150 people there. And he says, damn, he wasn't lying. Schulweis used to say, I don't count heads, I count feet. So, look.
Okay, I just, right.
A Jew exaggerate? They would do such a thing? Right? Would you? I mean, come on. I mean, you're trying to make the Torah story is trying to make a point. It's trying to highlight the miracle of the Exodus and the miracles of the desert. So if I tell you it was a small band of runaway slaves crossing a swamp, running away from Pharaoh's police, who then were guided across the desert by a Midianite shepherd named Moses, let's make it. It's not just 600. It's 602,000 men between the ages of 20 and 50. So that means it's got to be about 1,200,000 people and more if you count children and old people. They talk about 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people. How are they going to get across the desert on foot? How much water would you need to, and bathroom facility? How many porta potties would you need? Go ahead, calculate that for me. Okay, get it? And then look, the other thing is, I have to tell you this: Jews exaggerate. Ask any Jew who your great grandparents were when they came from Europe, and everyone tells you my great grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi. Turns out there were only Orthodox rabbis in Eastern Europe that came to America. Who knew? What an amazing thing! All the working people, the craftsmen, the tailors, the horse thieves, the cart, they never came. Only Orthodox rabbis came. We have this habit of changing the story to make the point. And that's why you get those numbers. Bert, did you want to say something? You're up. You have to unmute, sir.
Yeah. This was for Bill's comment. You know, when you talk about the various kingdoms coming from Syria down towards Egypt, they walked those same distances. The only difference with the people is they brought stuff with them. So they couldn't walk as fast as a trained army. But the idea of walking to cover those distances was the way that civilization moved from place to place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the way people moved in the old world. But you had a different sense of time as well. Because to do that kind of walking, you have to have a sort of patience. You know, it's not like me who gets antsy after a few minutes, you know.
When you got the Babylonians nipping at your heel, you move.
You find a way to move quicker. Right. So let's move now to another psalm. I want to move to a different psalm. I want to move to the next psalm. And this is Psalm 44. Now, you'll see right away that the psalm doesn't explicitly tell us that this is a psalm of the exile, but I don't think it's a far-fetched interpretation. So it has this title, for the leader of the Karhites, a maskil. That's just for the orchestra leader. And here the psalmist begins by talking about God's greatness. We have heard, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you performed in times of old, in their time and days of old. With your hand you planted them, displacing nations. You smashed peoples and drove them out. It was not by their sword that they took the land. Their arm did not give them victory, but your right hand, your arm, your goodwill, you favored them. So we begin with this address to a God who was all powerful. We have heard, we learned from our ancestors who you are. You are my king, O God, decree victories for Jacob. Through you, we gore our foes. Again, we don't like to think of ourselves as a warrior people, but that was part of our history. We too were a warrior. By your name, we trample our adversaries. I do not trust in my bow. It is not my sword that gives me victory. You give us victory over our foes. You thwart those who hate us, in God whose glory at all times, and praise your name unceasingly. Selah. Selah is the end of that stanza. So who are you, God? You are a God who is powerful, and you have lent us your power, and through you we have had victory. Through you we have vanquished our adversaries. But that only rubs it in, because now we feel differently. Now we experience something differently. Yet you have rejected and disgraced us. That's a pretty strong statement. You have rejected and disgraced us. You do not go with our armies. You make us retreat before our foes. Our enemies plunder us at will. You let them devour us like sheep. You disperse us through the nations. You sell your people for no fortune. You set no high price on them. You make us the butt of our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a laughing stock among the people. I am always aware of my disgrace. I am wholly covered with shame at the sound of taunting revilers and the presence of the vengeful foe. And here you have the cognitive dissonance. Here you have the cognitive dissonance. If we are the children of the God of the universe, and the God of the universe is invincible, then why are we suffering? Then how do you explain this suffering? How can it possibly be? And the possibilities, you can just sort of enumerate them. Either God doesn't exist, which is what the Babylonians were telling us, right? In the ancient world, if your God allowed you and your city to be vanquished, to be destroyed, then it was clear that your God is no God. That the gods of the victors are gods, not the gods of the weak. That's one possibility. The second possibility is that your God is a God, but your God has rejected you. Your God has chosen the other side, right? I mean, again, without getting into the politics of it, and I can't resist, but there are all these evangelicals that were preaching that God wanted President Trump to win the election, and now they have a problem of cognitive dissonance. So there was a preacher. I follow these things because I'm perverse. There was a preacher the other day, and it was on Facebook, who said that this is all part of God's plan so that Trump can run for re-election in 2024. That's clever. That's clever. I mean, but the idea is it's a cognitive dissonance. So did God remove favor from us because God has rejected us? Or is God not a God at all? But there's another possibility. And that is, can I build a religious system that can endure a disappointment? Can I imagine a religious system that can accommodate this kind of a catastrophe? And that's going to be the challenge of Jewish religion. Because if we can't, then there's no religion left. So what's going to be the answer? Look at the next stanza of our psalm. This is the third stanza now. Okay. All of this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. So, God, we haven't given in. We haven't betrayed you. We haven't let go. You have to see that. You have done all this to us, but we haven't let go of our love for you, right? Our hearts have not gone astray, nor have our feet swerved from your path. There's a scholar, he was at Emory, David Blumenthal at Emory, who wrote a book, and he made the claim that in the Bible, God functions as an abusive spouse. He applied the psychology of spousal abuse. Look, because this is what the abused spouse says, right? I'm not going to betray you. I'll be here when you get home, right? You can do what you want to me, but I'm not letting go of you. Though you have cast us, crushed us to where the sea monster is. This notion of you've sent us across the world to the deepest darkness. If we forget the name of our God and spread forth our hands to a foreign God, God would surely search it out, for he knows the secrets of the heart. We haven't forgotten you. And if we were to forget you, you'd know it. You'd know it because you know these things. In the previous psalm, it was, if I forget you, Jerusalem. Here it's, if I forget you, God. It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, that we are regarded as sheep to the slaughter. You'll know that if you ever read the Yom Kippur liturgy late into the afternoon, because that's the line that occurs in Ela Ezkara, in the martyrology service of the Yom Kippur, the traditional Yom Kippur liturgy. It's a line that was taken up by Jewish martyrs in every generation. For your sake, God, we have given up our lives. And therefore, and the claim is, and therefore, you owe us blessings. You owe us blessings. And he ends with no resolution, but just with this resolution of hope. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep? So the idea is that God is somehow asleep. Awaken, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face, ignoring our affliction and distress? We lie prostrate in the dust. Our body clings to the ground. Arise and help us. Redeem us as befits your faithfulness. This idea of a God who hides his face occurs in the book of Deuteronomy at the very end of the book. At the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses speaks about what's going to happen in the days to come. V'ha'azinu. In the Parsha of V'ha'azinu, he talks about the idea that if you betray your God, God will, and the phrase is, hide his face. Hastarat panim. Turn away from you. Think about the child who is needy of the parent, and the parent who wants to discipline the child, so the parent turns away, which drives the kid crazy, because what every kid wants is the attention of the parent. And here the notion is a God who is turned away from us. So the psalmist expresses his rage, his disappointment, his despair, his pain, and he doesn't resolve it. He doesn't say, by the way, we deserved what happened to us. You find that elsewhere in the Bible. You find elsewhere in the Bible the notion that we're being punished for our sins, but not here. Here, he resolves in this notion of hope, right? I know that this is happening to us, and I don't know why you did this to us, but don't let it be permanent. Don't let it be permanent. Come back and redeem us soon. And that's where he comes from. And he's able to hold on to both ideas at the same time. To the one hand, his belief in an omnipotent God who loves our people, and on the other, to the reality that our people is in exile and suffering. And those two realities, he holds on to them, but you can feel the tension. You can feel how fraught, how difficult that is at that very end where he says, why are you sleeping? Where are you in my life? Right? Why aren't you responding to me? And that's going to be the beginning of a whole school of thinking about why do bad things happen to us? Why do bad things happen to good people? But at this point, he's not interested in theology. It's not theology, it's emotion. It's the sense of a loved one, of a child, of a spouse who turns to the other and says, why would you do this to me? Or why would you allow this to happen? And here it is in the book of Psalms. Now, I was once doing a study when I was a rabbinical student, way back. I studied the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. And I wanted to try to answer the question, who let this book into the Bible? This is such a radical book. And why would they let it in the Bible? So I looked at lots of different interpretations of why they would let this book in the Bible. And I finally came to the conclusion at the end that the question is misplaced. The question is the opposite question. What makes you think the Bible has to have a particular philosophy? Or to put it in really very crude terms, what makes you think the Bible's an orthodox book? Yeah, there's a lot of faith in the Bible. Tremendous faith. But here you have a different kind of thing. And this psalm, I think, is one of those examples of stuff which is sort of unorthodox in the Bible. Because here you have a guy who accuses God of not just injustice, but of disloyalty, of unlove. And it's a remarkable statement. And yet it is contained in the book, because the book is not intended to offer a single monolithic ideological statement, a single theology. The book is reflective of the full repertoire of human experience. And included in the full repertoire of human experience is that sense of, I love you, but you've betrayed me. I love you, and you've let something happen, and I don't understand that. Come and talk to me. Come and explain this to me. Come and reconcile, which I think is the deep emotion of this psalm. All right, let's finish here. Any last questions, comments, counter sermons, fellas? Yeah, Douglas, please, let's unmute you. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Now you're good. Yeah.
I have a question for you. Are these sung, these psalms? Are these songs? Is this like experiencing a Bob Dylan song or something like that?
That's very good.
Where Dylan would kill you for trying to break up his lyrics and just say, it is what it is, and you got to experience it, right?
Okay. Very good. Very good. The word in Hebrew is shir. Okay. And the difficulty is that the word shir means both song and poem.
Okay.
So in Hebrew literature, poetry becomes song lyrics and song lyrics become poetry. And that, by the way, is a tradition to this day. I mean, we learn the lyrics of Naomi Shemer's songs, or the songs that are produced. Song lyrics are an important literary mode in Hebrew literature, and not simply the artistic expression of an artist who puts something out there and says, take it or leave it. Although Dylan, I would argue, because Dylan lyrics are famous. I mean, people parse Dylan lyrics all the time. Now, it would appear that these songs, these psalms, Tehillim, these psalms, were in fact sung in certain circumstances. And it's not hard to see where some of them were sung, because we even sing them today. Kabbalat Shabbat, which is Psalms 94, 95, 96, 97, and then 92, are sung, right? We sing them. Right? We sing them. This is and surely, and the idea we know from texts and sources that we know from our texts and sources that in the first temple period, right? That the first temple period, there were and the second temple, there were Levites who were orchestra, and this, if you look at the beginning of that psalm, just for the beginning, let me show it to you again. It starts here. For the leader of the Kohathites, a maskil. Now, the Kohathites were a class of Levites, right? A maskil is the name of a certain kind of song, although I don't know what it means. And for the leader, this is the conductor. So this is a notation to the conductor about how this is to be performed. These were actually performed. Now, when would you perform a psalm which says we are beaten and despairing and we're wondering, God, why you're watching and not doing anything about it? That would be an interesting moment to think about. Maybe something like the anniversary of a destruction. You know, they're here. When under what's the Zitzenleben? What is the life circumstance? The life circumstance of a psalm that angry, or that bitter, or that despairing is a very interesting question. Okay, other questions?
By the way,
Douglas, go ahead. Yeah.
When I think it was 4 years ago when we were in Tel Aviv, the Diaspora Museum had an exhibition on Bob Dylan.
Did it really?
In Tel Aviv. Oh, yeah. Now, interestingly enough, I thought I knew more about Dylan than the curator because he didn't catch the transition from folk to electric and what that meant and stuff like that. But, you know, it was, you know.
Lady Lay, right? Right.
That's actually his country period.
But, that's the country period, right. The other piece of this is, David just put a chat, the other mention, I think this notion of cognitive dissonance, of how you can maintain two very different thoughts at the same time, is something very important for us to live with right now. Because I appreciate that. Thank you. Because, if you read the newspaper, I don't know how many of you shout at the newspaper in the morning, but I'm famous for this, right? Because it's like, there's a sort of frustration with the way that the world is moving. And I think that in some ways the psalmist gives us a way of reminding us, look at this. I'll show you how to do it. Let me go back just for a moment because I didn't mean to do this, but look where he starts. He starts with his statement of faith, and then he moves into the dilemma. It starts with this: we've told who you are, God, by our ancestors, and we believe in you, and we see you in things that we know. So then why, God, are things the way they are now? And I would suggest that if you read the newspaper in the morning and you do a lot of shouting, start that way. Start by saying, I know what America is supposed to be. Start with your ideals. I know what America can be. I've experienced what America can be. And that's why I'm frustrated with what I see around me today. And that order of things, by starting with your ideals before you move on to that which gives you sense of frustration, I think will leave us in a much better place, all of us, because it'll remind us, if nothing else, it'll remind us that we're all in this together. Okay? Stan, you got a final comment? Then we're going to have lunch.
We had Bob Dylan in his time, but now we have more Leonard Cohen in our time. He's certainly more reflective of a lot of things that, are more, let's say, closer to today's world.
I'm waiting for the singer of our moment. I don't think we have anybody yet. I'm not a big fan of hip hop, although my kids say that there's stuff there, but I don't know. I was raised on, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, Simon and Garfunkel, and the Beatles. So I tell my children that any music recorded after 1972 is just not worth listening to. But that's because I'm a very old guy. Guys, it's been really good being with you, and I want to wish everybody a really good afternoon. And we'll see each other on Saturday morning at Torah Study for Shabbos.